Chapter 9. Exodus. The decision to evacuate Prypiat came as a relief to the 70-year-old Ukrainian Prime Minister Oleksandr Liashko. Under threat of being called alarmist, he had begun preparations for possible evacuation soon after Nikolai Ryzhkov woke him up with his call about the accident at 2:40 a.m. on April the 26th. Liashko was never able to explain why he argued in favor of getting ready for that eventuality, when everyone else in the top leadership of the Soviet Union and Ukraine seemed to be calm and confident that things at the Chernobyl plant were under control. As he observed, it was an intuition that presented a clear foreboding of danger to people. In the Soviet political hierarchy, Liashko, the head of government of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the second most populous constituent of the Soviet Union after the Russian Federation, was an important but not all-powerful figure. Above him was the party boss of Ukraine, First Secretary Volodymyr Chernobyl, a close ally and protégé of the long-serving former Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. On the all-union level, Liashko reported to the head of the Soviet government in Moscow, Nikolai Ryzhkov. Both Ryzhkov and Liashko came from the Donbass, the coal-mining region of eastern Ukraine, and they seemed to get along well. Indeed, Liashko seemed to get along with almost everyone. His no-nonsense, non-ideological approach to running the second-largest Soviet economy had won him the respect of his colleagues and subordinates. But on April the 26th, at a 10 a.m. meeting of the Supreme Ukrainian leadership, when Liashko began to talk about organizing Kiev city buses for the possible evacuation of Prypiat, many, including Chernobyl, were skeptical. Later, most of them would claim that at the time they knew only that there had been a fire at the Chernobyl nuclear plant and that it had been extinguished. The general feeling among the Kievan officials was that they should avoid sounding the alarm and incurring the wrath of the bosses in Moscow. There was little surprise that the top leaders of Ukraine, such as Liashko, had learned of the accident in Prypiat, on their territory, from Moscow. The Chernobyl plant was under the control of all Union officials in the Soviet capital. Although the Ukrainian party bosses and ministers could and did influence the appointment of top personnel at the station, including Viktor Brukhanov and Nikolai Fomin, they had no direct control over what was going on at the station itself. But the firefighters and police, the two rapid response agencies that were on site immediately after the explosion, were under Republican jurisdiction. Both reported to the Ukrainian Minister of the Interior. Under Kiev control also were the party and city authorities of Prypiat and other towns and settlements in the vicinity of the plant. While radioactivity at the plant became not only the concern, but also the responsibility of the all-Union authorities, the task of dealing with the consequences of the accident on the local level fell directly into the lap of the Republican officials, who, as things progressed, increasingly got the feeling that they were being obliged to clean up the mess created by their Moscow bosses. The Ukrainian leadership's main source of information on what happened at the Chernobyl nuclear plant was the Republic's Ministry of the Interior, which was under the joint jurisdiction of Kiev and Moscow. The Ukrainian Interior Minister, General Ivan Hladush, was awakened at about 2 a.m. in a hotel room in the city of Kharkiv. The news of the accident that the duty officer was about to give him was so sensitive that the officer insisted the minister leave his hotel room and go to a local party headquarters, where he could speak on a secure line. The Interior Ministry officials in Kiev were the first to receive information about the fire, but they thought they could handle it by themselves without alerting Liashko. Lieutenant Pravik radioed the level of alarm that mobilized all the fire brigades in the Kiev region minutes after the explosion. Major Vasil Kucherenko, the head of Prypiat's police department, managed to reach the plant ahead of Brukhanov. He called his superiors in Kiev from there to report on the explosion and the fire. There was disbelief at the other end of the line. "Do you know what you're saying? Is there someone beside you?" asked a senior police official in Kiev, who was eager to verify Kucherenko's report. By 5 a.m., a deputy minister of the Interior of Ukraine, General Hennady Berdov, and a group of senior police officers were on their way from Kiev to Prypiat. Berdov cut an impressive figure in the mayhem of the first days after the explosion. According to an eyewitness, he was dressed in a brand-new uniform with gold braid, a brightly coloured array of ribbons, and a badge testifying to his record in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Berdov was a calm but energetic officer who immediately took command of the more than 400 policemen who were dispatched to Prypiat from neighbouring towns and counties in the first hours after the explosion. They took control not only of the approaches to the plant, but also of the nearby railway station of Yaniv. There were not only sergeants, but also lieutenants, captains, majors, and colonels manning police patrols. Berdov was exposing himself and many of his subordinates to dangerous radiation. But in the first hours after the explosion, few of them guessed that they were dealing with something more than a regular technological disaster, with fire constituting the main threat to human life and public order. The first Deputy Minister of the Interior, Vasil Durdinets, who took charge of the ministry's actions in Kiev, later recalled that he knew nothing about heightened levels of radiation until midday on April the 26th. The civil defense authorities in Kiev were silent. Earlier that morning, when Serhii Vorobev, the head of the Civil Defense Department of the Chernobyl nuclear plant, finally reached those authorities on a civil defense line, the first question he heard was whether the fire had already been extinguished. "What do you mean, fire?" exclaimed Vorobev. "There's a general accident here. General! The population has to be informed." The Kiev official shouted in reply, "Alarmist! Think of what you're saying. They'd have our heads for such a report." Vorobev kept insisting on the seriousness of the accident. "The DP5 instrument, dosimeter, is off the scale, more than 200 Rontgens per hour." He was rebuffed. The record of incoming reports was later falsified to make it appear that Vorobev had called the Kiev Civil Defense headquarters later than he actually did. Premier Oleksandr Liashko recalled that when a civil defense unit was dispatched to Prypiat, its members simply did not have the right equipment to measure the radiation levels. Around 9 a.m., Durdinets, who had spent most of the night in his office at the ministry, called the leaders of the Republic to inform them of the previous day's developments. The report on the Chernobyl accident happened to be one of many items on his agenda. Valentina Shevchenko, the chairwoman of the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet, the nascent Republican parliament, which at that point served as a rubber stamp for the party authorities, and a member of the Republic's supreme leadership, alleged later that Durdinets had mentioned Chernobyl at the very end of his brief summary. He told her that there had been a fire there, but it had been extinguished. On the following day, the report from the Republic's Ministry of the Interior to the Central Committee suggested that the fire had been put out by 8 a.m. "And what about the people?" Shevchenko had asked the Deputy Minister. "Nothing special," came the answer. "Some are celebrating weddings, others planting their gardens, still others fishing on the Prypiat." Shevchenko immediately called Prime Minister Liashko, who was in his office discussing the situation at the Chernobyl plant with one of his deputies. He had already ordered the mobilization of transport for the possible evacuation of Prypiat. The civil defense units were under the joint jurisdiction of Kiev and Moscow, as was the Republic's Ministry of the Interior, and Liashko used his power over both structures to start the mobilization. When the commander of the Republican Civil Defense Organization suggested that it would be difficult to get the bus drivers to come to work on Saturday morning, Liashko called the Minister of the Interior, Ivan Hladush, and ordered him to use police officers to inform the drivers relaxing at home about the mobilization. "Is it serious there?" Hladush asked the Ukrainian Premier. "I don't know, but organize the mobilization and dispatch of transport to the area of the Chernobyl plant together with civil defense, as if you were doing it under wartime conditions." Alerted by the news both from Moscow and from his Ukrainian subordinates, Ukrainian party head Volodymyr Shershibitsky, the supreme leader of the Republic, called a meeting of the Ukrainian Politburo for 10 a.m. The news received from Viktor Brukhanov in Prypiat via local party officials was not too disturbing. The fire had been extinguished, and radiation levels were high, but within the norm. "Aren't you in too much of a hurry?" Shcherbitsky asked Liashko, who had already ordered the mobilization of transport facilities. "The commission will come and give a competent assessment. Take action then." Liashko refused to call off his order and asked for time until the situation became clearer. "Well, and if no evacuation is needed, how much will your action cost?" Shcherbitsky asked the premier. Liashko refused to succumb to pressure from the party boss. I replied that if everything was all right there, we would charge all expenses to civil defense. Because we had done so in the past, we would charge several million to civil defense. Shcherbitsky finally gave his approval, but that was not enough. Around 11 a.m., Liashko called his all-union boss, Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov, and got his permission as well. By 1400 hours, I had a report that 1,200 buses and 240 trucks were ready, recalled Liashko. Shcherbitsky still had doubts. That day, the Kiev and Ukrainian KGB headquarters had filed 2 reports on the situation at the Chernobyl power plant and the city of Prypiat. The first of them, which reflected the KGB's understanding of the situation in the late morning of April the 26th, already indicated heightened levels of radiation, but the levels reported were significantly lower than the actual ones recorded by Vorobev. According to the KGB report, the radiation level at the plant was estimated at 20 to 25 microrontgens per second, and in Prypiat it was 4 to 14 microrontgens per second. The rise in radiation levels was attributed to contaminated water that might have escaped from the cooling system of the reactor damaged by the explosion. The second KGB report, based on information available at 3 p.m. on April the 26th, estimated radiation levels near the reactor at 1,000 microrontgens per second, at the power plant at 100 microrontgens per second, and in Prypiat at 2 to 4 microrontgens per second. They were still relying on dosimeters with a scale of only 1,000 microrontgens per second. But Liashko already had all the authority he needed to start preparations for the evacuation, at this point as a precaution. Judging by reports submitted to the Ukrainian Party's Central Committee, the order to begin the evacuation came at 8 p.m. on April the 26th. Columns of buses and trucks began to assemble along the rural routes of the Chernobyl district that evening. 2 trains were ready to take passengers at the nearby Yaniv station. Bus drivers and train engineers would spend the whole night, sometimes in close proximity to the power plant, waiting for orders to move into the city. They did not know whether the orders would come or not. At the first session in Prypiat of the government commission summoned by Mayorets on the evening of April the 26th, General Berdov had reported that buses were ready in case evacuation was called for, only to be rebuffed as alarmist. A few hours later, the members of the commission saw the reactor awakening and sending radioactive fireworks into the sky around Prypiat. The tone of the conversation changed, and sometime after 10 p.m., Ukrainian Prime Minister Liashko received word that the commission, now with Boris Chicherbina participating, had concluded that the reactor was damaged and that there was a threat of further radioactive contamination. It would take the all-Union authorities a while to give the final go-ahead for starting the evacuation. Liashko was on the phone with Prypiat throughout the morning of April the 27th to make sure that the evacuation was actually taking place. By 2 p.m. he finally got word that the evacuation was about to begin. He was no longer an alarmist. He had turned out to be right. The evacuation was necessary, and now the government commission was ready to carry it out. As the party and city authorities debated the question of evacuation, residents spontaneously began to leave the city en masse. The first to leave on the morning of April the 26th were the wives and children of the firefighters. Their husbands and fathers had paid the high and sometimes ultimate price for the knowledge that what had happened at the power plant was not just a fire. It was a nuclear explosion that had released invisible waves of radiation that incapacitated and killed without warning or mercy. Volodymyr Pravik's parents could not refuse their son when he begged them from a hospital ward to take his wife and daughter out of Prypiat as soon as possible. From the Prypiat hospital they went directly to Pravik's apartment, put his wife Nadika and 1-month-old daughter Natalka into a motorcycle sidecar, took them to the railway station, and got them on a train speeding away from Prypiat. The next to leave Prypiat were the firefighters themselves, especially those who had suffered the most from radiation poisoning. Leonid Shavre, the firefighter who had reached the nuclear plant in the same truck as Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik, realized that there was something unusual about the fire he was trying to keep in check only after 5 a.m. on April the 26th, when he was allowed to leave the roof of the turbine hall, where he had spent most of the night. He lit a cigarette and suddenly felt a strange, sweet taste in his mouth. "What sort of sweet cigarettes are these?" he asked his fellow firefighter. Pravik had complained even earlier about the strange taste in his mouth. The medical personnel provided them with potassium iodide pills and water to wash them down. It was then that Shavre began to vomit. It was impossibly revolting, he recalled. "I wanted to drink, but drinking was impossible. I felt nauseous immediately." The medics wanted him to go to the medical center, but Shavre refused. He went home instead, put his wife and young child in their car, and drove them away from Prypiat. In the late afternoon of April the 26th, when Leonid Shavre returned to Prypiat after leaving his wife and child with relatives in a nearby village, he went straight to the hospital to check on his fellow firefighters. Shavre's commander, Lieutenant Pravik, was looking out of a window, his face swollen. "How are you?" asked Shavre. "All right," came the not very assuring answer. "What about you?" Shavre responded in the same tone. "All right, too." In general, he found most of his colleagues in good spirits. Pravik and others explained that they had been given intravenous medication and injections. They did not say much more. Shavre left for home, hoping to see his friends again the next day, but when he showed up at the hospital, they were already gone. It took the doctors a while to figure out the most effective way to treat their patients who were sick from irradiation. The first suggestion was to make them drink milk. "He needs milk, lots of milk," said a doctor to Lyudmila Inatenko, the wife of the firefighter Vasil Inatenko, who was among the first to be admitted to the hospital. "But he doesn't like milk," responded Lyudmila. "He will drink it now," came the answer. Together with Tetyana Kibenok, the wife of Lieutenant Viktor Kibenok, who was in the same hospital room as Inatenko, Lyudmila drove to the countryside to get milk. They came back with enough 3-liter jars to cure the whole ward, but Vasil Inatenko and others began to vomit after taking their first sips. Only then did the doctors who were treating the firefighters for gas poisoning try intravenous injections, most likely of nitrates, which appeared to work. Later that evening, Lyudmila could already see her husband standing near a window. Viktor Smagin, one of the reactor operators who had replaced Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov on the night shift in the Unit 4 control room around 8 a.m., was brought to the medical center by ambulance 6 hours later, suffering from headache, dizziness, and uncontrollable vomiting. He began to feel much better after 2 hours of intravenous treatment. Smagin recalled that he had 3 bottles of liquid fed into him. Once off the intravenous feed, he wanted to go for a smoke. The patients had to leave all their clothes and personal belongings behind when entering the medical center, so there were no cigarettes around. But friends who came to check on those hospitalized were happy to help. One of them attached a bunch of cigarettes to a string that Smagin lowered from his second-floor window. With the cigarettes in his pocket, Smagin went directly to the smoking room, where he found his fellow plant operators. They had been temporarily restored to a semi-normal state by the intravenous treatment. Alexander Akimov, and Anatoly Dyatlov were there, discussing the possible causes of the explosion. So were many other engineers and operators. But not everyone was able to walk, despite the intravenous treatment. Leonid Toptunov was among those who stayed in bed, his skin brown from the radiation tan. His lips were swollen, making it difficult for him to talk. The firefighters and power plant operators who had been exposed to the highest doses of radiation were flown to Moscow for treatment in the late hours of April the 26th, even before they could bid farewell to their loved ones. Their evacuation was carried out in utmost haste, with the time of the departure kept secret even from family members. The decision to evacuate the firefighters and reactor operators most affected by radiation exposure was made by a group of doctors and scientists from Moscow who had flown into Prypiat on the afternoon of April the 26th. They came from the Institute of Biological Physics, which was attached to the Ministry of Health, and from Moscow's Hospital No. 6, which specialized in the treatment of radiation sickness and had the experts and equipment to deal with the immediate victims of the accident. The chief of the radioactive diseases ward, 61-year-old Dr. Angelina Guskova, had been treating such patients since 1949, when, as a young doctor in the closed city of Chelyabinsk 40, the site of the first Soviet plutonium facility which had been built to produce the atomic bomb, she had cared for the Gulag prisoners who were the guinea pigs of the early Soviet nuclear program. Now her doctors came to Chernobyl to treat the firefighters and nuclear plant operators. Guskova's doctors were looking for signs of acute radiation syndrome, which usually occurred in people exposed to more than 50 rontgens of radiation. For measuring acute radiation syndrome, the doctors used units called grays. Grays are defined in terms of the amount of energy absorbed by the human body in a dose of ionizing radiation, with 1 gray being equivalent to 1 joule per kilogram of irradiated material. How it relates to REM differs according to the type of ionizing radiation involved. In the case of beta radiation, 1 gray is equivalent to 100 REM. It corresponds to 1,000 REM in neutron radiation and to 2,000 REM in alpha radiation. Depending on the units of measurement of radiation and its absorption and impact on the human body, signs of acute radiation syndrome start with a one-time exposure of 50 Röntgen or more and absorption of 0.8 of a gray of ionized radiation. Symptoms include lack of appetite, nausea and vomiting. After the absorption of more than 50 grays, symptoms begin almost immediately. They include nervousness, confusion, watery diarrhea, and sometimes loss of consciousness. For those absorbing a dose of between 10 and 50 grays, loss of appetite, nausea and vomiting occur within hours after exposure. For those receiving 1 to 10 grays, the same symptoms set in anywhere between several hours and 2 days after exposure. In all cases, radiation kills stem cells in bone marrow, but radiation in the range of 10 to 50 grays also kills cells in the gastrointestinal tract. When radiation exceeds 50 grays, the cardiovascular and nervous systems are affected. All patients go through 3 main stages of the disease. In the first stage, symptoms of the syndrome appear. In the second, latent stage, patients may appear to be fine, and they feel well. In the final stage, the symptoms return with greater severity. Only patients in the first category, those who have absorbed less than 10 grays, have a chance of surviving, which is estimated at approximately 60%. Patients in the second and third categories die. The Chernobyl patients, 134 men and women diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome, were later divided into 4 categories. In the first, which included some 20 people with an absorption rate of between 6.5 and 16 grays, almost everyone would die. In the second category, which included almost the same number of people, who had absorbed between 4.2 and 6.4 grays, about 1/3 would die. For the patients who had absorbed between 2.2 and 4.1 grays, the statistics were much better, with only 1 person dying. There were no deaths recorded in the fourth category, between 0.8 and 2.1 grays. Altogether, 28 people died of acute radiation syndrome within the first 4 months after the exposure. 12 of the 13 patients who received bone marrow transplants did not survive the ordeal. The deaths of close to 20 patients in the second, third and fourth categories that followed in the years after the accident were not attributed by the doctors to the radiation exposure. The doctors from Moscow who came to Prypiat on April the 26th were highly experienced in dealing with patients affected by acute radiation syndrome, but they did not have the right equipment to measure how much radiation they had absorbed. They looked instead for the first symptoms and relied on the blood tests. One of Guskova's top experts, Georgy Selidovkin, had flown to Prypiat to assess patients on the spot and decide who should be brought to Moscow for immediate treatment. Many of those in the Prypiat hospital would remember Dr. Selidovkin because he had a beard, and that was uncommon in the Soviet Union of the 1980s, when it was taken to be a sign of either decadence or free thinking. Selidovkin began examining patients sometime after 4 p.m. on April the 26th. Guskova, who stayed behind in Moscow, got on the phone with her colleagues in Ukraine. The doctors from Moscow examined close to 350 patients, looking at their skin, asking about when they had first started vomiting, and measuring the number of leukocytes in their blood. Leukocytes, or white blood cells, are produced in the bone marrow and have a rapid turnover rate. They are among the cells most easily damaged by radiation. A drop in the number of white blood cells is an easily recognizable effect of radiation exposure. By early evening, Dr. Selidovkin had 28 patients whom he considered top priority cases. Among them were Pravik, Kibenok, Inatenko, and most of the other firefighters, as well as the reactor operators Akimov and Toptunov and the deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov. They had to be taken to Moscow without delay. Time was of the essence and could mean the difference between life and death. The 34-year-old deputy mayor of Prypiat, Oleksandr Liashko, was charged with making sure the 28 people selected by Selidovkin and his colleagues were taken from Prypiat to the Boryspil airport in Kiev and then to Moscow as soon as possible. A few days earlier, Liashko had reported in the local newspaper on the results of the Lenin Subbotnik, the unpaid Labor Day, organized by the party in a show of devotion to the founder of the Soviet Union and his communist ideology. Now all that seemed very far away. There were posters glorifying Lenin all over the city, but its inhabitants were now facing a new, post-ideological reality. Liashko's first task on the morning of April the 26th had been to arrange for a vehicle to wash radioactive dust off the streets of the city. He then had to deal with the evacuation of those who had found themselves with too much of that same dust on their skin and in their intestinal tracts. The aircraft offered by the Civil Defense Office was waiting at the Boryspil airport. Buses and ambulances were lined up as well. The main challenge turned out to be the documentation that had to accompany the patients to Moscow. They had to surrender all their documents very early on the morning of April the 26th, upon entering the hospital in Prypiat, and there was no easy way to match individuals with documents and test results. No document in the Soviet Union was deemed legitimate without a stamp, but the requisite stamps had been left at the power plant. It was decided to forego the stamps. With paperwork ready, Liashko faced a new challenge, dealing with the relatives of those to be evacuated to Moscow. Prohibited from entering the hospital, they besieged it from the outside, and once word spread that their loved ones were about to be taken to Moscow, they went into action. All the wives got together in one group. We decided we'd go with them, recalled Lyudmila Inatenko. Her husband, Vasil, had just shouted to her from a window that they were about to be taken to Moscow. "Let us go with our husbands, you have no right." "We punched and clawed," said Lyudmila, recalling her actions and those of the other wives. They were pushed back by soldiers who had formed a cordon around the hospital, but they did not give up. Then a doctor showed up on the doorstep of the hospital and approached the wives. He told them that their husbands were indeed going to Moscow, but needed a change of clothing. The outfits they were wearing when they arrived at the hospital were radioactive and had been burned. The wives rushed across the city to their apartments to fetch clean shirts, trousers, and underwear. It was late at night. Public transportation was not running, and they had to walk. In fact, they ran. But when they came back, their husbands were already gone. "They tricked us," recalled Lyudmila Inatenko, "so that we wouldn't be there, yelling and crying." Oleksandr Liashko left for Kiev at the head of the 2 buses and 2 ambulances carrying the patients. The buses accommodated 26 patients who were still able to walk, while the ambulances took 2 reactor operators who could not. Hot water and steam burns covered more than 30% of their bodies. On reaching Kiev, they drove along its main boulevard. Khreshchatyk, an incongruous group of men in pajamas looking out the windows of buses that Kievans, still unaware of what was going on in their backyard, largely ignored. The buses headed for Boryspil. They arrived soon after 3 a.m. on April the 27th. A few hours later, ambulances in Moscow, their interiors covered with plastic to prevent contamination, collected the Prypiat patients at the airport and delivered them to Guskova's Hospital No. 6. The doctor, who had cut her teeth on prisoners of the Gulag, was ready to start her job. Liashko had carried out his task, starting the evacuation of his city. On the way back home to Prypiat, he passed hundreds of buses heading there as well. The evacuation of the entire city was about to begin. The columns of buses, which had been waiting on the roads between Chernobyl and Prypiat for hours, absorbing high levels of radiation, began to move at 1:30 a.m. on the morning of April the 27th. Levels of radioactivity in the city were rising quickly. On April the 26th, radioactivity had registered in the range of 14 to 140 millirontgens per hour, but by about 7 a.m. on April the 27th, it had risen to between 180 and 300 millirontgens. In some areas close to the nuclear plant, it had jumped to as many as 600 millirontgens per hour. The original plan had been to begin evacuation on the morning of April the 27th, but the decision was made too late to meet the deadline. It was decided instead to start the evacuation in the early afternoon. To many citizens of Prypiat, the evacuation came not as a surprise, but as long-awaited relief. Intercity telephone networks had been cut, and the engineers and workers at the nuclear plant had been prohibited from sharing news of what had happened with their friends or relatives. But the family and informal networks that had always served Soviet citizens better than state-controlled media were active. Rumors about the accident at the power plant had begun to circulate in Prypiat a few hours after the explosion. Lydia Romanchenko, an employee of a Chernobyl construction firm, recalled, "Sometime around 8 in the morning of April the 26th, a neighbor called me and said that her neighbor had not returned from the station. An accident had taken place there." That information was soon confirmed by another source. "Our dentist friends said that they had all been awakened at night because of an emergency and summoned to the clinic, to which people from the station were taken all night." A good Samaritan, Romanchenko decided to share the news with her own friends and family. "I got in touch with my neighbors and close friends right away, but they had already packed their bags that night. A close friend had called and told them about the accident." The city of Prypiat was slowly awakening to the reality of the disastrous accident in its midst. Lyudmila Kharitonova, a senior engineer in a construction firm, was on her way to her country house, a dacha in the neighborhood of Prypiat, when she and her family were stopped by police. They had to turn back to the city, where they saw foam on the streets. Roads were being treated with a special solution by water trucks. In the afternoon, military personnel carriers appeared on the streets, and military planes and helicopters filled the sky. The police and military were wearing respirators and gas masks. Children returned from school where they had been given potassium iodide tablets and were advised to stay indoors. We began to be more alarmed in the evening, remembered Kharitonova. It's hard to say where the alarm came from, perhaps from inside ourselves, perhaps from the air, which by then was beginning to take on a metallic smell. A rumour began to circulate that those who wanted to leave could do so. Still, there was no official information on what had happened and what to expect. Kharitonova and her family went to the Yaniv railway station and got on a train to Moscow. Soldiers were patrolling the Yaniv station, she recalled. There were lots of women with small children. They all looked a bit confused, but they behaved calmly. But I felt nonetheless that a new age had dawned. And when the train pulled in, it seemed to me so different, as if it had just come from the old, clean world we used to know, into our new, poisoned age, the age of Chernobyl. Soon after 10 a.m., on April the 27th, the city authorities called in representatives of enterprises, schools and institutions to draw up evacuation plans. Worried citizens rushed to the city party headquarters. Dressed in full uniform, General Hennady Berdov, the Deputy Minister of the Interior, appeared on the steps of the building and calmed the agitated crowd. His army of policemen was sent to apartment buildings to knock on doors and ask people to prepare for evacuation. The final decision was made by the Government Commission, with the blessing of the Moscow authorities, at noon, a mere 2 hours before the start of the evacuation. Deputy Mayor Oleksandr Liashko, who had just returned from Boryspil, was given a new task: to evacuate the rest of the patients of the Prypiat hospital, altogether more than 100 people suffering from radioactive poisoning. The party officials wanted him and his charges to be at Kiev's Boryspil airport by noon. The rest of the patients were supposed to go to Moscow as well. It was 10 a.m., and the deadline was anything but realistic. The trip to Kiev alone took close to 2 hours, and then there was all the paperwork to be done. They were finally ready to leave by noon. This time there was no hope of deceiving the wives and family members of those who were leaving, and Liashko did not try to do so. Amid the hugs, tears, and cries, he managed to assemble his group of patients and set out for Boryspil. But no sooner had they departed than they had to stop. One of the patients needed urgent medical help. The buses stopped in the village of Zalisia, a few miles away from Chernobyl. The men wearing pyjamas got out of the buses to stretch their legs and have a smoke. It was then that Liashko heard a woman's cry. It took him a while to understand that one of the young evacuees was from Zalisia. His mother had recognized him and could not control her feelings of shock, grief, and despair. "Just what we didn't need. Such a coincidence," recalled Liashko. "Where she came from, I had no idea. The words, 'Mama, Mama,' with which the young man tried to calm his mother, stuck in his mind." Eventually they left Zalisia. Liashko was so disoriented by the events of the past 24 hours that when, in the office of the director of the Boryspil airport, he was asked to pay for a few cups of coffee from a local coffee shop, he could not comprehend the question. "It was as if I had come from another world," he recalled. The two worlds turned out to have borders and border controls. Before Liashko and his drivers were allowed to leave Boryspil, they had to wash their buses and take a shower. The high radiation levels caused by the accident were already an open secret. They left for home around 4 p.m. on April the 27th. As they approached Prypiat, they saw buses moving in the opposite direction, all 1,125 of them. The evacuation of the city had begun. Prypiat's city radio station transmitted the announcement soon after 1 p.m. "Attention, attention," came the calm voice of a female announcer speaking Russian with a strong Ukrainian accent. "In connection with the accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station, unfavorable radiation conditions are developing in the city of Prypiat. in order to ensure complete safety for residents, children first and foremost. It has become necessary to carry out a temporary evacuation of the city's residents to nearby settlements of Kiev Oblast. For that purpose, buses will be provided to every residence today, April the 27th, beginning at 1400 hours, under the supervision of police officers and representatives of the City Executive Committee. It is recommended that people take documents, absolutely necessary items, and food products to meet immediate needs. Comrades, on leaving your dwellings, please do not forget to close windows, switch off electrical and gas appliances, and turn off water taps. Please remain calm, organized, and orderly in carrying out the temporary evacuation. The radio repeated more or less the same announcement 4 times, but most people still did not understand the seriousness of the situation. Just imagine, recalled Anelia Perkovskaya, a city official. It was only an hour and a half before the evacuation. Our children's cafeteria in a large shopping center was full of parents and children eating ice cream. It was a weekend day. Everything was nice and quiet. For 36 hours after the explosion, people were given no reliable information about it and left virtually on their own. They were never provided with instructions on how to protect themselves and their children. Radiation levels that, according to Soviet laws, were supposed to trigger an automatic warning to the public about the dangers of radiation exposure had already been recorded in the early hours of April the 26th, but they had been ignored by one official after another. Finally, people were asked to gather their belongings and wait on the street a mere 50 minutes before the start of the evacuation. They were good citizens and did exactly what they were told to do. A film shot on April the 26th and 27th by local filmmakers preserves images of a wedding taking place in the city attacked by radionuclides. It shows young men and women dressed in light summer clothes, with their small children walking the streets, playing soccer on sports fields, and eating ice cream in the open air. These scenes look surreal when juxtaposed with others shot by the same filmmakers. Water trucks cleaning the streets, policemen and soldiers in protective gear atop troop carriers, patrolling the streets of Prypiat, and people waiting for buses that would take them away from their homes. One frame shows a doll on the windowsill of an apartment building, seemingly waiting for the return of its owner. Sparks and white flashes in the film frames reveal the true meaning of what we see on the screen. These are scars left by radioactive particles attacking the film through the thick lenses of the camera. Lyubov Kovalevskaya, the author of the recent article about quality control problems at the construction site of the Chernobyl nuclear plant, was among the thousands who boarded buses that afternoon, never to return to their homes. She had spent a good part of the previous night calming her elderly mother, who could not sleep after hearing rumors about imminent evacuation. Now their whole family, Kovalevskaya, her mother, her daughter, and a niece, were ready to leave. They were told that it would only be for 3 days. There were already buses at every entrance, recalled Kovalevskaya. Everyone was dressed as if to go camping, people were joking, and everything was rather quiet all around. There was a policeman beside every bus, checking residents according to a list, helping people bring in their belongings, and probably thinking of his family, whom he had not even managed to see in the course of those 24 hours. The bus set off. The Chernobyl filmmakers kept shooting, now from the window of a departing bus. Theirs turned out to be the last images of the city still full of people. By 4:30 p.m., the evacuation was all but complete. The authorities were eager to report their first success to Moscow. Shecherbina called Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov. "Nikolai Nikolaevich, there are no people left in Prypiat. There are only dogs running around." People had not been allowed to take their pets. They were low on the scale of Soviet sensibilities, if they registered at all. A few days later, the police would create special squads to kill stray dogs. But dogs were not the only ones remaining in Prypiat. Close to 5,000 workers of the nuclear plant stayed to make sure the shutdown of the other reactors proceeded as planned. Young lovers took advantage of their parents' departure to have their apartments to themselves. Finally, there were the elderly who decided to stay behind. They could not understand why they had to leave when the evacuation was only supposed to be for 3 days. "We had to convince people," recalled the Ukrainian Interior Minister Ivan Hladush. He was generally very proud of how well his people had carried out the evacuation. The next day he reported to the Ukrainian Central Committee that altogether 44,460 individuals had been evacuated and moved to 43 nearby settlements. "We took people to the villages," he remembered. "We took over clubs and schools and lodged people in apartments of local residents. Everyone had an understanding attitude." Valentina Brukhanova, whose husband, the Chernobyl plant director, had stayed in Prypiat, was evacuated like everyone else and ended up in one of the villages of the region. Newspaper reporters found her there a few days later, working on a cattle farm. The KGB officials informed Ukrainian party authorities that of the evacuees who had moved to the towns and villages of the nearby Chernihiv Oblast on their own, close to 1,000 people altogether, 26 had been admitted to hospitals with symptoms of radiation sickness. The KGB was busy curbing the spread of panicky rumors and unreliable information, but it could do nothing about the diffusion of radiation. The evacuees brought not only their irradiated bodies to their temporary homes, but also their contaminated clothing and personal belongings. With the evacuation of Prypiat and its nearby villages complete, the buses returned to Kiev. They were assigned to their regular routes, where they spread high levels of radiation around a city of 2 million people.